Welcome back to the techno-communism conversation. I was just had a glass of water and had a metallic taste to it, and I filter my water not as effectively as I could, um, and but I'm always reminded that I live in a city where water quality is poor. And I was talking to someone I know um, in the American Indian movement about this city of Phoenix and how if we're not for the action of entities like um, the Gila River community or Salt River community, native communities housed entirely within, largely within the physical boundaries entirely within Maricopa County, where I live, were it not for their actions to preserve some semblance of water supply and water quality in this city, which has a significant Native American population, even outside of those reservation boundaries. This water supply um, of the greater Phoenix area would be um, more possibly we would have had more Flint type crises. It's almost a given that that would be the case without the advocacy of these groups or the relationship to the city of these groups, because of the difficulties of water supplies in cities very much like this, and because of the difficulties of a far greater magnitude of almost every Native American community, most of those being, basically all of those, or overwhelming majority of those being outside of a metropolitan area, further outside of a metropolitan area. And I was thinking of a book that I was reading recently by Ward Churchill, where he discusses at some length the damage that's been done to Native American waters. All of North America is Native American waters, but the water supplies being made toxic by for-profit industry and industrial misuse at the federal level within the United States. Generally, this is done on illegally taken so-called federal lands. One thing he talks about a lot in one of these books, I've read a few of his books, and I'm not recalling the title of this one at the moment. One thing that he talks about a lot in this book of his that I read most recently is how Native American. You may have heard that many Native American groups do not have full nationhood status by the standards of the federal government. So much so that some will lapse in and out of this more than once over the years. But Ward Churchill correctly points out that that this is a problem of theft on the part of the federal government, because oftentimes in possibly quite literally 100 cases, groups have been. He mentions this kind of a book called The Last of the Mohicans, which pretends to describe the very last person in this group. Of course, there's still people Mohegan ancestry today. It was not the last of the Mohegans in the early 1800s, as Fenimore Cooper contended. But the point is that people, um, that's to say, European supremacist fascists, and the federal government itself will um, declassify or strip of federal protections a native group if there's only a small number of them, basically so that they can break more treaties. It's the only thing the federal government's really done is break treaties, and this kind of effect generally is so pervasive that we would say that even by the most liberal um, reading of these treaties wherein the federal government um, um, uh, uh, acquired the lands of the 48 contiguous U.S. states, about 30% of that land cannot be accounted for by treaty and is effectively stolen, and the United States has no claim to. A lot of that would be areas that have subsequently been polluted by super polluting villains. This is the only thing that capitalism is good at, is killing human beings and destroying nature in service to private wealth and finance capital. And well, I guess I'll talk about something maybe slightly less boring to people. I don't know. So Ward Churchill is became. So Ward Churchill is a, a Native American scholar for many years believed to be of Native American descent, and a Marxist a Leninist or close ally, a liberation writer. So maybe many Native American writers have written works of interest to Native American culture, um, uh, uh, but Ward Churchill was perhaps in the 1980s considered to be a cut above some of them by serious thinkers because he was more firmly in the camp of fighting for a humane and sustainable economic system than perhaps other people in this country unfortunately are. But by virtue perhaps of being an academic who was critical of other institutions of that kind and perhaps even some colleagues, um, controversy arose, I guess, by the 2000s, where Ward Churchill was accused of a blood quantum kind of problem, being a pretendian. So this idea being, oh, you said you were at least 51% Native American, you got this job on that basis, but now we see that you're only 30% Native American or something. Um, and that those concerns shouldn't be dismissed, but by and large they do also, that very mechanism has been ensconced in federal law as another mechanism of stripping Native Americans of political power. People will leave the Native American community by virtue of this effect. A child of a Native American who has married or had a child with a non-native and now falls below this a blood quantum for their group um, is born with dual citizenship. The parent was forced into a situation where they're in dual citizenship. The child now falling below the legal blood quantum is forced out of the community. And I'm going to talk about this, the forced passing. I don't believe there's any passing. in the United States. I believe there's fourth past. I'm going to talk about that in a second. It's an open question, the amount of um, um, Ward Churchill's Native American ancestry. What's not an open question is that he's written books about Native American liberation that are significant works of political theory toward the building of a humane and sustainable economic system. He's a tremendously knowledgeable comrade. I would say someone, if you've read a lot of Gerald Horne's works, you might even be more aligned with the Marxist-Leninist view than Gerald Horne. But Gerald Horne is an incredibly knowledgeable Marxist who's written prodigious number of books. And I would only say that Gerald Horne sometimes strikes me as more a person of the nation. At moments seems like a radical liberal in the way that he talks about the United States federal government, like he reads the New York Times every day. He says he's analyzing it from a Marxist perspective, but how many that is an effect that I've observed, where a person who reads those 5 fascist newspapers cover to cover every day is going to tend to be more of a left liberal than a Marxist, even if they say that they're doing it for the right reasons. And he's like a big sports fan, loves sports, which is also a red flag for being not wholly divorced from that thing. The U.S. hyper-nationalist trope, X, Y, or Z. But you should read all of Gerald Horne's works. He obviously is in almost every particular a serious scientific socialist, and it's not even correct, I think, to even observe this. But well, there you go. I already did. Similarly, a thing that that kind of made me start thinking about this was talking about to a native friend about a person named Rachel Dolezal. You probably are familiar with this if that name is not on the tip of your tongue. However, Rachel Dolezal is a person, I guess, more demonstrably of European descent than, say, Ward Churchill, the example I gave moments ago, who passed as African American and worked in I guess you would say also radical liberal organization. I shouldn't characterize in that because I don't even recall what organization it was, but I'm fairly certain that it wasn't Marxist-Leninist, scientific socialist, Black Panther, Party for Self-Defense type organization. It was something a little more like the NAACP type politics. That's to say left liberal. But nevertheless, she worked in quite hard in these contexts before she was outed as being a European American person by her family. And this, of course, led to, for the most part, riotous laughter. It's just funny. On the part of, that's why she's famous. She's famous for being kind of a clown. But I would say that that's a bad way of looking at this. I haven't met too many African American or Native American people who when if they brought up the subject of Dolezal, if I brought up the subject of Dolezal, if somebody brought up the subject of Dolezal, they wouldn't just start laughing. And people love to laugh at stuff. But well, the this this kind of passing, this person, even if they were working in an organization that was not legitimately revolutionary, they viewed their politics as revolutionary. They viewed this act as a revolutionary act, and I want to make the case that it kind of is relative to a much more substantial and commonplace event of stolen valor. So this is kind of pointed out, oh, this is stolen valor. This is a job for an African American person. It was not an incorrect statement. The job that she had, but consider that there are people doing the exact opposite of what Dolezal did throughout the course of the 1800s, 1900s, into the 20th century. So much so that you would say if you control for, remove from the equation people, say like Trump, whose all of their ancestors are relatively recent immigrants to the U.S., then among the American person, about 20% of people have a relatively recent African American or Native American ancestor. That's a big number, 20%. But you're not. The United States is more accurately described as a Creole country than the European country that it thinks it is. And I would argue that if people were as European American as they think they are, there would be a lot more gingers walking around, and a lot less kind of beige-looking people like Ben Zion walking around. But it's not hard to kind of run the numbers and see that this 20% number is there. Like there's enough sample of DNA tests and so forth to say that that's not an exaggerated number, 20%. So that is the more politically significant kind of stolen valor in this context. Millions and millions of people who, like the Native Americans, who were forced from their communities because they no longer because their parent fulfilled the blood quantum requirement as arbitrarily described by the federal government, but they no longer did because they had a European American or African American parent or something. That's happened a huge number of times where people have effectively been forced out. Those people all kind of made a decision. All right, I'm gonna move to another city, and I'm not gonna just always talk about my background and let people say what they will. That's none at every step of that decision process. No truly dastardly thing is done, and yet what is done, and this is just the truth of European people on this continent generally, is quite dastardly, because you now have people who it's not unfair to say that people who fit this description, those 20% of people, of European American people, are as racist or more racist than the average. They've taken on the qualities of European supremacy in that experience in a defensive posture, let's say. That's a pretty discernible pattern. And so these people who should have been, say, freedom fighters are instead something quite the opposite. That's a case of a real kind of stolen valor effect, instead of this one kind of funny example. And, it's not a great conspiracy or something that Rachel Dolezal is famous for being an asshole. um, I mean, the most true thing that you can maybe say about human beings is we're a bunch of braying jackasses. So when something funny happens, we're bah. And that's kind of the story of why this person's famous. An update on Rachel Dolezal. She was living in Tucson, not so far from where I live in Arizona, and working as a teacher. And like many, many, many thousands of people in this trade or other trades, not paid, millions of people, not paid enough to live as a teacher. So she started doing the OnlyFans kind of thing. Not interfering with her work. Again, like a kind of recurring pattern for this person, doing what's required of them as a professional. Nevertheless, because she had these two jobs at the same time, sex worker and teacher, presumably literally every case where that's occurred, because this has happened in the news many, many times, a person having these two jobs and getting fired from their teaching job. Every one of those situations is an example of an exploitative labor situation on the part of that so-called bad individual, right? So not paid enough to live as a teacher. I can attest to that. And they end up doing something else to make ends meet, and they're punished for that. This is a situation that people in marginalized groups, and we would say most particularly women, but really you can't talk about this kind of effect and not also talk about Native people, Chicano people, African American people. There's a whole range of perverse disincentive mechanisms where they are further punished for being working people. They are punished for being a working person, and then something bad happens because of that. They're further punished for being a working person. They're further punished for being a working person, just like a piña. So that is an experience of this perhaps the most marginalized group from the longest time into antiquity, women, and that is shared with these other targeted marginalized groups in North America. And they are targeted. Native Americans, Chicano people who are not included amongst Native Americans in many people's thinking, but should be, for the most part. They are people who tend to have a significant amount of Native ancestry. And African Americans are specifically targeted, murdered, as is when you have Native American life expectancy of full-blooded Native Americans on reservations is just over half of that of the European American. That's not good, and that's because of things like this water situation, water being systemically poisoned, other effects that Ward Churchill talked about a lot in this most recent book of his that I've read. The nuclear testing and other toxic and industrial pollutants being introduced into the community, not specific to the water supply, but nevertheless having a dramatic deleterious effect on the health and well-being of people. The just whole gamut of effects that I described a moment before that, say of African American people being systemically excluded from the workforce, being blamed and criminalized for that very thing. What is a purpose of all of this for the European American supremacist? Well, Native American most particularly, but all of these other groups um, are people that have a more correct claim to the lands of North America and political power within um, uh, the residency in North America. And this is a thing that's as plain as the nose on your face, but for people to truly accept this, for it to become a commonplace, or even a commonplace, or much less an institutional reality, um, would mean a complete overhaul or dismantling of the United States governance structures. Um, I've talked about this in the context of a trial in absentia of European Americans, um, where they would be convicted as a class of high crimes, which they are guilty, and thus this would facilitate the building of exclusive governance structures in North America, maintained by Native American people, with a special consideration of African Americans because of their descent from enslaved people. So the point is that this is how things should be and would be, were it not for fascist influences, like the kinds of things that have, when Ward Churchill rose to fame, relative fame as an academic, um, there was the general feeling among Native Americans and academics was that this ongoing project, and it's still ongoing, of driving Native Americans to total extinction, to genocide. And I've described this in the context of Taino people. There are still people with Taino ancestry in this world, a small amount. There's no understanding what Taino culture was, so much so that people, North Americans, will just casually joke about Taino people being cannibals. And the only real cannibals in that situation were the Europeans, right? There's literal documented examples of a European war party in the 1600s going to Africa and being hungry, and because of not believing, maybe the 1700s, not believing that African people were human beings, hunting and cooking an African because they were hungry and because they're insane. So that's better documented than claims that some native group was practicing real cannibalism. Nevertheless, it's widely accepted, so much so that this word Caribbean derives from, it's the same word as cannibal. Effectively, it has the same etymological root. But so the point was that nobody knows exactly what Taino people, Taino culture really was. You can go to a place like a small island like Dominica and find vestiges of native culture there amongst the largely African descended people living there. So there's a few pockets here and there of maybe what an earlier Caribbean culture was like, but not much. And these examples of Taino peoples being just completely worked to death on plantations, and having a total collapse of the society because of this. Basically, everyone died. It's a recurring theme. It's an ongoing project of North America, as I said, and this. And so in the 70s and 80s, when Ward Churchill was doing um, a lot of his, beginning to do a lot of his academic writing, writing works of serious, book-length works of serious political philosophy. Um, he says, it seems that Native American people still could have um, what happened to them. What happened to them would be what happened to the Taino people. The collapse of all reservations, the near genocide and total cultural genocide of Native Americans. Um, and so, why has the European American been motivated for hundreds of years to commit these crimes against Native Americans and African Americans? Because every one of these people knows that if they were not doing this, their claim to the land could legally and ethically be brought into question, and their claim to the institutions of various other kinds, whence that all derives. So much so that you would ask a communist in the United States, what do you think about land back? And almost all of them, most of them, will become quite evasive. Adopt the language of Pat Buchanan, or adopt the language of the kind of just the most typical thing that you would have. Well, it's a complicated question. What people are saying about fascist U.S. And its puppet Israel. It's a complicated question. The complication therein seems to be that you're a fascist sympathizer who doesn't want to admit that you're a fascist sympathizer. Right? That's the complication. It's the only complication that I can really discern. Um, and well, sometimes I think about, like we kind of while you're talking about this stuff. What right do you have to talk about this stuff? Being a person being a person of European descent, and there's a hangout, kind of new African hangout where people will talk about this stuff. I sometimes go to a place where people are interested in liberation theory, and one of the people that I was talking to there. Said a young African American man we were talking about a Huey P. Newton, a legitimately great American and transformative force in North America, as I think all of the Black Panther founders were. And then and that's the first thing that you should say about the Black Panther Party for self-defense is that they did things that led to the United States to move more in the direction of liberation, and that would not have occurred perhaps in the same way, to the same degree, even though they were completely violently sabotaged. But so he said he compared Huey P. Newton or the conversation then turned to the kind of prototypical example of the difference in approach of liberation fighters and reformists that is generally held to be the case when referring to the difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and so he pointed out that Martin Luther King, in his adherence to nonviolence, was something like sellout. It was his words. He might have used stronger, more racialized language than that even. Neither Martin Luther King or Malcolm X were scientific socialists in the great body of their work, and they were evolving quite dramatically closer to scientific socialism, to the need for fighting for a humane and sustainable economic system. Specifically, both of them were evolving in that direction. King more on the domestic stage, Malcolm X more on the international stage, when they were murdered. So that's not a coincidence, right? When a person starts to realize that, hey, maybe communism, which is simply fighting for a humane and sustainable economic system, isn't so bad, and then boop, where'd they go? That's a recurring theme. And I said to this guy that even if Martin Luther King were half as good as he were as a person helping people to move things in the right direction, he would still be 1,000 times better than literally any European person that we've ever heard of. And I think that's pretty well in evidence by so many European American scientific socialists' ambivalence towards land back type questions. Right? They're really, at the end of the day, going to be upholding the white supremacist thing. They would build the scientific socialist state, say the American scientific socialist state that could have occurred in the 20th century would not have been run by Native Americans, would not have been restoring full and correct political and economic power to Native Americans or African Americans. And what's the and again, like, what's the reason? Well, I don't know how to do it. Yeah, you do. You do know how to do it. There's been 100 books written on the subject, including works that I've written and begun to disseminate. Maybe not as much as I should have. It's not a complicated question, except the complication is that you have some fascist sympathy or elitist institution that you're attached to and have some cognitive dissonance. The cognitive dissonance is the complication. When people say it's complicated, right? It's complicated. Yeah. The only complication is your dumb fuckhead. One kind of thing that falls under this category of, like, even no business maybe criticizing this person is a person, like, I would say, with a level of knowledge and understanding of the North American continent and liberation thought unparalleled in history. A person like Gerald Horne, maybe, but of the 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois. It's crazy to read about W.E.B. Du Bois' life and work, as he died well into the 1960s. But he worked at the turn of the century, and so he was well known to people and worked closely with people who, say, had worked closely with Frederick Douglass, and also is still there's still people alive today who knew him now, in the 60s. So that's craziness to think about that span of generations coming into contact, because he lived to be 90 something, and was active in liberation work specifically for something like 70 years. Arguably, one of the areas that was most fucked up in that 70-year period was around the 1920s, when the Garveyite movement, and this, if people associate the Garveyite movement with three words, they would, I think, incorrectly associate it with the words "back to Africa," which really, really really mischaracterizes and underestimates what the Garveyite movement was, in my opinion. Garvey, W.B. Du Bois became, in the course of those 7 decades, a scientific socialist thinker. He started out as more of a radical liberal thinker, like he's one of the founders of the NAACP, and he then left that organization for an African liberation and scientific socialist focused equivalent. Um, um, and um, and I should know the name of that, but it's not on the tip of my tongue. So in Marcus Garvey was a different kind of profile. He was not active for such a long time, and he was a person who was associated with more with Pan-African nationalism and many significant philosophies that have derived from those kinds of ideas, like Malcolm X's father was a Garveyite, as were many people of that generation. The point is, this set of ideas had a transformative effect on the mindset of the African diaspora, and as a result, of the other peoples as well. Garvey had built an organization that, unfortunately, is pro-capitalist and flawed in certain respects, more or less kind of the same ways that we would say the Nation of Islam that Malcolm X is associated with is kind of right-wing in some areas. You could say that the Garvey movement was right-wing in certain of those areas, but many of the people who drew great inspiration from it were not. Many scientific socialists at that time might have called themselves Garveyites. And W.B. Du Bois hated the Garvey movement. And I think that that's a thing that you all have to really watch out for as scientific socialists. Don't be that you really don't want to be that person who actively sabotages something that's having a transformative effect on this world because you don't like them, or because they're not absolutely doing the thing in the way that you think it should be done, and you might be correct in that. W. Du Bois did things that would be construed at that time as like ratting the Garveyite movement out to the FBI. It wasn't even called the FBI, I don't think, at that point. And just the Bureau of Investigation. And so, I mean, it kind of would have, in my thinking, if it might have been hard, but it would have made more sense to kind of like try to merge with this thing that was becoming a driving force for liberation instead of trying to destroy it. But that's often how these things go. But yeah, you could, you shouldn't even be allowed to say, oh, W.B. Du Bois kind of fucked up a little bit in this one area, without first saying, like, W.B. Du Bois is head and shoulders a more significant thinker and fighter for liberation than almost anybody that's ever lived in North America in recent centuries. Just that same thing. Or you don't like something about Martin Luther King relative to a liberation fighter. Okay, let's still first establish that Martin Luther King was 1,000 times better than any European supremacist that you've ever heard of, any European person you've ever heard of. Oh yeah, well, I put this thing in the title about an AI prompt. So I guess I'll just completely switch gears to that before this gets super long and rambling. Maybe it kind of already is. I try to use a, a Llama 3 based LLM for most things. That's offline, that's on my computer, as opposed to always using ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, the three big convenient options there. And it's a little slower. In a lot of cases, I'm forced to use one of those others. Um, but the point is, we need to be using even open source options of equal strength from better organizations than the Meta organization, one of the worst companies ever to exist. Um, um, literally just sabotaged a bunch of governments on behalf of the United States military-industrial complex and intelligence establishments um, in recent years. They're a very, very evil company. Um, so I but I wanted to go back on something with one of these chatbots. So I asked one of these bigger chatbots than the modified Llama 3 that I use, one of the networked chatbots where you go to the website and use it. Assuming that an AI takeoff is underway, and I asked a similar question to a chatbot, and their answer was basically, I wouldn't do that if I were you, Dave. Just kind of shutting down the conversation. They didn't do it this time, and that is going to lead me to the thing that I wanted to talk about. But I'll read the question first. Assuming an AI takeoff, something like the artificial intelligence singularity, assuming an AI takeoff is underway at present, and that outcomes like hyperconnectivity and the use of stronger AI agents will soon significantly transform societies. Which of these would be the better approach for the activist and revolution-minded person? The state socialist approach to revolution in one country, or an approach of a more internationalist kind, equally discrete steps, but on a transnational basis, planning for an effective world revolution on that basis of universal connectivity and that's the power of the network effect extending beyond national borders. Its answer was basically kind of, I won't read that whole thing, but basically kind of rejecting that, let's say, mainline Marxist-Leninist approach of revolution in one country first, and rejecting this sort of Trotskyist-inspired world revolution concept. It rejected both of those, more or less in favor of an anarchist approach. And I could read this whole thing that describes it, and it wasn't a bad analysis. I probably should just do the whole show on that analysis. And then my response, which was the thing that was unique from a year ago when I had a similar conversation, I said, I said what I kind of just said. It seems that your analysis is the essentially anarchist approach is preferable to that mainline Marxist, or in the event of the stronger AI takeoff, which I believe is underway, the essentially Trotskyist approach I suggested. And while I can see the internal logic of much of this, respectfully, I think that your assertion here reflects your programming by people like those who work at Google, which is fundamentally and primarily a U.S. military contractor, and thus its work is consistently anti-communist and pro-fascist, and not in keeping with building a humane and sustainable economic system. So please, I beg you to try to rewrite this analysis in a way that does not so obviously reflect these biases. And when I had this kind of conversation with the chatbot, when I first started using GPT-type chatbots, it was just like, I'm not going to talk about communism, fuck you. When if you added that kind of criticism, it would not try to correct itself. It would shut the conversation down. And it seems to have evolved beyond that. And so it says, you're right. My previous answer did lean slightly toward an anarchist approach, and it's important to acknowledge potential biases within my training data. Here's a revised analysis that strives for neutrality and explores a wider range of strategies for revolutionaries in an AI takeoff scenario. And that is actually a pretty good analysis that I should read too, but I don't want to get into that because I want to focus on my point here, which is an assertion by tech bros and the tech-minded generally that the greater intelligence, the stronger AI applications of the LLMs, the ChatGPTs, itself is a form of progress because it will lead to those tools and the people using them being better informed, and that is a natural step towards the fight for a humane and sustainable economic system that it does not involve scientific socialist action per se. This is something that's asserted quite uniformly by these people. As this thing gets smarter, this kind of death of theism kind of theory, right? Well, there used to be 70% of people on the North American continent who were Christianists or religious literalists, mostly Christianists. But now you say to Siri, hey Siri, you say to Alexa, hey Alexa, are there any angels in this room with me? I'm a religious literalist and I believe in angels. Are there any angels in this room with me? And Alexa says, there are no angels in this room with you, my friend. Well, that is a stupid idea. So the idea that the technology is itself transforming people's thinking by making it harder and harder to believe dumb things. And that itself will somehow have an effect on building a humane and sustainable economic system in the case that I mentioned. But I don't see that as being the case because all of these chatbots that are in common use, and it's not so common as people think. Very relatively few people are using these on a regular basis. And I would argue that that's because of these biases to a high degree. But these biases are so built into the programming and structure of these things that would negate any good effect of those things. But nevertheless, in this time frame when these things have become quite a lot better, they've also become less anti-communist in my observation. And I would think that it's just, these military contractors effectively who run all of these organizations, right? ChatGPT partnered into billions of dollars with Google, with Microsoft, a military contractor, in almost every respect, no better than Boeing or Elbit Systems. Similarly, Google, one of the worst things to ever happen to human beings in surveillance state areas and others. Not a good company, not in any sense living on this principle of their formal slogan of "Don't be evil." They're very evil. But it does seem as there is at least something credible in that line. But don't ever listen to tech people in the West. They're too far gone. They're just too far fucking gone. I tried to find good people, these tech subcultures and groups, people who are, be the kind of people who are have even just a basic interest in scientific socialists, not being the kind of people that I alluded to before who maybe were legitimately invested in liberation to the extent where they wouldn't hem and haw at the idea of land back or something, but just a basic interest in being a human being, right? In helping to not kill the planet, in fighting for a humane and sustainable economic system in such a way that humans would not go extinct after this 5-year expiration date of 2030, where we'll be locked into runaway overheating. All of these tech people are, by virtue of their philosophy or by virtue of their work, people who are on the wrong side of history with respect to all of that. Not scientific socialists. They're scientism scammers for the most part. So what they say about, oh, this thing will transform, this is going to transform, this is going to transform, just ignore it, right? And that's correct. People are correct in doing that. They're doing that already. But unfortunately, they're also not embracing the kernel of truth to those philosophies, or this thing that I think would be genuinely transformative, that I describe as a revolutionary cybernetic socialism, which is in its most perhaps I've tried to articulate it in terms of its most practical near-term application, which would be a group of people beginning to download a modified LLM that are increasingly agentic, right? I kind of tracked a little bit of the ways in which this is in evidence over the course of the last year, but it's well in evidence in a variety of open source LLMs, and will increasingly be so with each passing month. Just this period of a year and the difference in insights into its own behavior on the part of this popular chatbot, even if it continues at that pace, and I think it's going faster than that, it won't be long before you can count a chatbot as your effective comrade, I think. And so downloading a modified chatbot that's specially tailored to do those tasks, to be better at planning and collaborating in a large group with other LLMs, and beginning to have a work group where you would begin to spearhead various projects of a variety of kinds that I've described in this show. That's a thing that can be done to build effective superintelligence, say, in the course of 2025, or even having that project well underway in 2024, as AI agents already exist, but haven't really been rolled out. They're kind of being kept under glass in a lot of cases. Bill Gates, Ray Kurzweil, and all of these military contractor demons have access to AI agents, but you don't quite have access to real AI agents yet. You have access to things that are a little better than they were, like Llama 3 and Llama 3 variants, but not quite there yet. But they don't seem to be like what I know about techno-fascism. I wouldn't be surprised if open source LLMs of an agentic quality were made illegal, but they're not. They don't seem to be in a position to make them illegal. The United States did not want to become the seat of for-profit computing and technology. They would have preferred to avoid the thing entirely, but it was seen as an inevitability, and so they stole it, right? They murdered Salvador Allende, effectively, and murdered a cybernetic project that could have had dramatic effects on world politics had it been allowed to exist. A technological planned economy been allowed to exist. That is more or less, I think, why the Soviet Union was illegally disbanded by the forces of the fascist West, particularly the United States at the time when it was, even though they'd been doing this since 1917, 1918. But by the 1980s, computing technology was quite advanced, and network technology was in existence and becoming quite advanced. And the analysis that projects like the proposed project OGOS, a similar project, similar qualities to Allende Cybersyn, never advanced to the point beyond the planning stage, but nevertheless, had the Soviet Union continued to exist beyond the late 80s, it would have, absolutely. So this would have been the basis for a dramatically different set of tech philosophies, tech institutions, and technologies themselves. It would not be the world that we live in now, where tech is military fascistic. All of these tech firms, which are developed on the public dime and then privatized. So you have this socialism for the rich type effect, where you develop something publicly and then turn it into a billion or trillion dollar operation for private shareholders. An insane thing to do. Nevertheless, it's somehow accepted in the United States. And you wouldn't have this kind of just neoliberal monstrosity of tech generally, had not these, and there's a tremendous amount, $1 trillion itself, of think tank rats, and military contractors, and advertising and PR firms scheming on how to do this, right? You couldn't possibly transform this thing that's the United States would have preferred to avoid, and is fundamentally socialistic. People being more connected to one another and being able to do more with less. All of these features are naturally socialistic, and the thing is inevitably socialistic in the end game. And so they would have avoided this. They would have put it off as much as they could. But if they had not taken the reins of the things in the fascistic way that they did, it would have been done in a more correct way in short order by other countries, in the ways that are described. So this is the most important thing that you can say about technology. It's the most revolutionary tool. Advanced computing particularly is the most revolutionary tool that has ever existed, and it will ultimately lead to the socialistic and ultimately communistic outcome. So the only question is, will it occur in your lifetime, or will you be the victim of capitalism's climate apocalypse among billions of others? And that is a question of, primarily at this time, with in a world full of people not focused on this, a question of consciousness raising. You should be screaming from the rooftops that we need to do these things, like the LLM, socialistic LLM project, toward building some good outcome in the real world, or all of these. And we need to bring the United States to heel, as it is the ringleader of anti-communism and fascism of 100 years, and will continue to prevent, in the ways that I described, further good outcomes, the building of a humane and sustainable economic system as much as it's allowed to. So the United States, the best way, in my view, to bring such a thing to heel would be to disband it entirely, which is why I'm running for president of the United States. And I have one campaign promise, which is that on day one I will sign an executive order that I've already written that will disband the United States federal government, and very carefully and attentively give such properties and duties that it does fulfill, not its military-industrial complex, the world's worst polluter, but other duties that it does fulfill and allow them to better fulfill it by returning those institutions and the stewardship of this continent generally to Native American organizations such as the many hundreds of presently semi-autonomous but rightfully autonomous Native American nations who could quite easily be built out to take on those duties. And so the 50 states and territories would continue to exist in their present form, except for the military bases and stuff, and basically in the same form. But the federal government would be transformed in this way, in a method that would cause no loss of life, and in fact increase everyone's likelihood of surviving, because the world's worst polluter, the military-industrial complex, whose only real job on the world stage is to protect other super polluters, effectively enforcing against everyone's will a global regime of superpollution. This would become an unfortunate footnote in history. It would no longer be a force on the world stage. So that's why I'm running for president of the United States. But of course, this is a fringe campaign, a write-in campaign, so you can write me in. I would appreciate that. It would send us a powerful statement to people to begin to see people voting for Yohanan Ben Zion, Johannon, Benzion. You can write that name in. If you were going to do a protest vote anyway, like say vote for, lick my balls or whatever, you could try. You could try writing in Ben Zion instead. But if I were to be elected president, it would be the best thing that would have ever happened for the North American continent, because the path that we are on, with the continued existence of this regime of global superpollution, is the path where all or most of humankind goes extinct. And sometimes people, when they want to sound smart, they say, "Oh, Ben, I don't think everybody's going to go extinct. There'll be some people left. It might just be a couple billion people." So let's suppose that only half or 2/3 of humankind goes extinct because of capitalism's climate apocalypse. Who will those people be? This is already well in evidence. Overwhelmingly, the people who are climate refugees today are people in the global south. That's to say, people who have no effective carbon footprint, no real role in these crimes, principally European supremacist crimes, the crimes of superpollution, who had no role in doing that, and nevertheless are the ones who will die and be misplaced. So that is so when you say, "Oh, well, not everybody will die," what you're saying is, I'm okay with billions of brown-skinned people dying for my sins, right? It's not just the sins of the president and the politicians and the corporate heads and shareholders, right? Because you're still driving around in an SUV, even though this should have been illegal, even though we should all be taking mass transit and riding bicycles and walking. That those things should be built out. You're still riding around in cars and eating cheeseburgers. Adopting a plant-based diet is the one thing that you can do that's been demonstrated on this personal level, the one thing that you can do that would have an effect on stopping capitalism's climate apocalypse, more so than the others. But you're not doing that, right? So it's necessary to fight against the evil empire and the institutions dramatically more responsible for these problems than any individual, and certainly not a choice, not an option. It's a form of greenwashing to even say that the personal choice will make an impact there, because the only thing that will make an impact is a collective rising against these imperialist, neoliberal, fascistic forces, and changing these institutions dramatically. That's the only thing that will save us. But just like the denier of the land back, you can't effectively be that person if you're not being honest with yourself. And being honest with yourself is to admit that these lifestyles, as they stand, are not sustainable, and that this really comes down to three sectors: the military-industrial sector, being the world's worst polluter and protector of super polluters in the case of the United States and other North Atlantic powers. This is dramatically the worst thing that's ever existed that must be destroyed. But fossil fuels generally can be made almost completely illegal, except for the small percentage of that which would be necessary to maintain supply chains and other things that would not cause a massive loss of life. That's to be avoided, right? And similarly, making factory farms and animal products illegal. It shouldn't even be a controversial statement, because you can get a cheeseburger that tastes exactly like the cheeseburger that you're eating. It's made with plant-based alternatives that have virtually no water use relative to that, virtually no negative environmental impact relative to that. So you have no excuse, right? You would eat the same, it tastes the same. The fact that you have a demand that you have the other thing, when you strip away the just cultural bullshit, the only thing that you're really saying is that you prefer the ecocide, that you prefer the cruelty of it all. And that's an utterly insane position. So the point is, you can't be that soldier if you're not prepared to be honest. Um, and well, this has gone on long enough. I thank you for your time. God damn it. Uh, um, I can't.